Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another live Film Fanatic video for my good old YouTube channel. Hope everyone's doing good. Want to really thank everybody for the support and the love. It's been really cool. The last week or so, been getting a lot more hits and a lot more subscribers, and it's been pretty fabulous. I really enjoy doing this. All of those positive things always I look at those aspects of this channel as just giving me extra fuel to continue doing this little weird thing that I do. It's kind of like you know, I don't know, a diary. I look at this whole channel and the whole idea of this whole thing as like a diary or just a reflection of kind of the history of films that really mean a real that have a or films that have a deep meaning for me, and movies that I just find really entertaining, movies and directors that always continuously inspire me, and things that not only do they inspire me just personally in a lot of ways, but just artistically too. They really always inspire the music that I try to write and the music that I do write, particularly around my band Quantum. It's a huge inspiration for everything that I do in that band. It's more so film and everything that involves really is the biggest influence on me musically. It's really interesting. I remember as a kid when I first got into certain groups. Well, one example of that was I grew up listening to a lot of, like most kids in the 90s or 80s, particularly in the 90s. I grew up as a metalhead kid, and I always loved. First, it was thrash metal. Then I got into more extreme music. After that, I got into the death metal scene. And then from there, I really got into the whole black metal scene, and that was really the big kind of turning point as far as where I started to get into music even more. But at the same time, I was into all kinds of things. I had a lot of diverse exposure to a degree at a young age to just different things, and particularly around electronic music. I had friends in high school that were DJs, and they were always making like mixtapes. They were doing like these early versions or forms of like what would eventually be known as like techno. I was exposed to a lot of that as a kid. I became a huge fan of that stuff, and then I grew up in New York, and in the '90s, that was the just such a kind of a mecca for American hip hop and rap music, and what's become known as like hip hop and rap now. And I grew up listening to a lot of that music too, so I always had a pretty open mind, and I always but around that time when I got exposed to all that music was when as a listener, I got really serious about checking out a lot of artists and started following a lot of artists, started going to a lot of concerts. And when I eventually, like years and years later, I got into other kinds of music, world music. I expanded my love of electronic music. I got really obsessed with all things electronic. Everything from got exposed to groups like Autechre and Aphex Twin. Autechre I've talked a lot about on this show. They're my favorite band, if you want to call it a band. It's two guys from England, but they're my favorite artists of all time. They're just amazing, and I got so exposed to a lot of cool things, and then around that time, I also got exposed to a lot of jazz, and it was an interesting time because suddenly, when I was listening to a lot of electronic music, and when I first got into jazz, it took me a while to be open to a lot of jazz music. It was funny because when I first heard a lot of jazz, I always thought everything kind of sounds dated. It sounds old. I didn't really like the sound of the drums on a lot of the old records from like the 50s. I got exposed to most of the music that was in the 50s and 60s. but particularly in the 50s. And I always thought that the music sounded initially like, I don't know, just kind of dated in a weird way. I thought all the drums and the instruments sounded kind of dated and not very well recorded. I don't know. It was a weird thing. I had all these weird hangups. And then like about a year or two, and I had a teacher, I had a drum teacher for a while who was really trying to turn me on to jazz and various groups. Lots of Miles Davis, John Coltrane, John Scofield, a whole bunch of different artists. And I, for those reasons, I knew I should appreciate this new music that I was being exposed to in this new art form. But I just had these like weird, I don't know, kind of hang-ups about it. And I knew I should really love it, but I just couldn't really get into it. And then one day I remember, and during that time too, I was, listening to a lot of other kinds of music, a lot of the music I grew up on and electronic music, but I tried to always have an open mind. And I remember one day I listened to, and I had been listening to it for a while, and suddenly it just clicked. And I couldn't get into it for the longest time, but one day it just clicked, and it was the Miles Davis album, Kind of Blue. And suddenly that became like a total obsession of mine. And then I I started thinking of music in a different way. I started thinking of it in visual terms. Suddenly, after I got really into that album, I started to have this different experience around music. Every time I would listen to music, it put me into this visual mode of where I was like picturing um, different landscapes, different worlds or different climates. Sometimes I would listen to music and it would put me in a mindset of being in like a deep forest during winter, particularly around black metal. But it was all around that time, and when I got really into kind of blues, suddenly music took on this new thing of where I started thinking visually about things. And that's kind of where it started for me as far as thinking of music on a different in different terms of like a visual thing. And it was also the time of where I, started to really get into film. So it was an interesting combination, and I was in my mid to late 20s when that happened. So ever since then, and particularly around the quantum thing, it's always become music for me has not just been a thing of where it might, represent, say, the particular mood that I'm in, or might put me in a particular mood, like in a certain emotional state, but it became a thing of where not only was I feeling certain things when I would listen to music, but I was also visualizing things. And that's kind of where it evolved to. That's kind of where it started. So I always think of quantum in terms of the visual aspect, along with all of the music that we write and that we try to create and that we record and that we perform. And that's kind of where the whole like aesthetic around, I think, films and all those things have like really been uh, kind of pulled in to that band. It was kind of an interesting thing, and suddenly there was a shift, and it became a much more um, immersive experience. And I've always carried that experience with me, and nowadays it's very much a visual thing and an emotional thing. So that's usually how I go about kind of creating the music. And if it puts me in a certain state, utilizing those two kinds of things, then I usually am pretty happy with it, and I'll move on to the next thing. So it's an interesting thing. And again, that's all tied now. It's all tied tied in with movies. So it's a very kind of like a giant warm blanket. It just envelops kind of every aspect of my head or my brain. Kind of an interesting thing, kind of weird, but so. But today, well, yesterday, I should say Friday night. Today is Sunday, but Friday night we had unusually cold temperatures. It got down to minus 30 degrees Friday night. It was pretty insane. And I yesterday, and then yesterday was pretty cold, not as cold as it was, and now it's pretty normal. It's like in the 30s, pretty like normal temperatures for the winter. But I put a post up last night or yesterday saying that that those temperatures that we had on Friday night put me in a John Carpenter The Thing 1982 state of mind. And I thought it was pretty funny, but that's what it made me think of, like right away. And again, it goes back to kind of what I was saying in the beginning of the show. It put me in this visual place. Like, not only does that movie, make my, make my heart and my blood flow even more, but on a visual sense, it puts me in a place. So I think in terms of everything on a visual level, which is, a little bit abstract. But I thought those temperatures that we were experiencing, kind of like this weird, overwhelming kind of Arctic blast thing, made me think of The Thing. And that is John Carpenter's The Thing, which came out in 1982. The one terrible thing, and I have no idea why it's the case, but I don't own this on Blu-ray. I have no idea why. Um, I just need to do it. I feel terrible that I don't own this on Blu-ray. I have a really great DVD copy of it. I have a few. I have two other versions, I believe, on DVD. This is actually a really great edition. This is like a collector's edition, and this came out years and years ago. I bought this used. I don't even know. I don't remember where I bought this, but it's actually a really great DVD because it's packed with special features. There's all kinds of behind the scenes. There's documentaries on this movie. I have seen this movie so many times I can't even count or fathom. I did a big show on the franchise of Halloween way back in the day. I also did a special show. Yeah, I did a show where I covered most of the Halloween films about, well, around Halloween time. I also did a show about John Carpenter. It was on his birthday. One of my all-time favorite directors in horror of all time. He's made some of the greatest films, I think, in the horror genre. Halloween, The Thing, Escape from New York is one of my all-time favorites. Just so many great films. Big Trouble in Little China. But I have to say that The Thing is definitely my favorite John Carpenter film. This movie was, I feel, in a lot of ways, well, particularly around the effects department, but I think in a lot of ways this movie was a revolutionary feat because this movie was done for very little money. I think of John Carpenter as being one of the first like true pioneering directors kind of in the independent world. When you think of like Halloween when that came out in 78, it was shot for nothing. No, virtually no money whatsoever. And it was, completely outside of the Hollywood system to a degree, and it went on to make, tons and tons of money, and it really put him on the mark. And I think at that time in the 70s, it really showed that, the independent voice is really a real viable thing, and that's a voice that needs to be listened to. And I don't know, I feel like he opened the way the gateways, or opened the doors for a lot of like so-called independent horror filmmakers. Very low budget, a very very small cast. Uh, there was no budget for any real high scale effects. It was all about creating a space, creating that environment. And that's really due to Dean Cundey, who is my favorite cinematographer of all time. He's worked on all of John Carpenter's films, and he's done all kinds of other movies also. He's like one of my all-time favorites. He's definitely my favorite cinematographer. And with him, it was like this minimalist approach, but just creating this like real spooky vibe. and really paying attention to the details and creating that space of horror. Just a master filmmaker, master cinematographer, and I always regarded as John Carpenter to be a master filmmaker. So many great films. The Thing is the movie I have always gone back to. It's my favorite, easily my favorite John Carpenter film. It's always hard to say that, or to pick your favorites, particularly around a director that you really love or look up to. But um, the Thing is the one that I've seen the most, and also Halloween. Getting back to Quantum, anybody who's seen any of our shows or seen photos of our performances, it's a thing that's directly pulled from movies. I like to incorporate costumes to a degree and wigs, and particularly I really love to use like masks during the show, and the shows, and I also try to have a visual thing going on with some lights and other things like that around that, and that's all taken, especially the mask thing. That's all taken from my love of horror films, and I look at perfect example of that is Halloween. Like that's totally the mask killer, the boogeyman, that whole aesthetic. That's totally taken from, every time I use a mask in any of our performances, it's totally taken from like say Halloween or Friday 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, any of those mask killer kind of you know villains. That's exactly what it's taken from. So, it's such a part of my brain, it's such a part of my DNA. The other thing, too, that I feel like with the Thing that makes it just kind of a revolutionary thing is the effects. And the effects were created by the genius Rob Bottin. Rob Bottin is just a legendary guy. Tom Savini is probably my favorite practical effects guy. He did all the classic slasher movies, most well known for his work on the Friday the 13th franchise. But he's done, during the 80s and the 70s, he was responsible for so many slasher exploitation movies, just an insane amount. But then Rob Bottin is also up there for me because he was another effects guy who did all kinds of great, classic, amazing 80s horror movies. The Howling is probably my all-time favorite werewolf movie. He did all the effects for that one. The Thing is just next level. Like the effects in that movie are just things of legend. Like it's just unbelievable, and how everything. It's the definitive definition of practical effects because everything you see on screen that Rob Bottin created, and he was really young when he made this movie. I believe he was like 20 years old, 19 or 20. Like it's just insane. It was one of his first gigs, and he went on to have a legendary career in all things horror. But when you think of like the work that he created in The Thing, it's so revolutionary, and the level of detail that he used, but the level of imagination in that in The Thing is just absolutely incredible. I mean, it's unlike anything else, and it has. I see that now a little bit in newer horror films where things always have a cycle and things kind of go back, and I see now in more recent horror films there's a little bit of a return to like the bare bones thing. There are still lots of films that are very much CGI driven and very computer generated. But I've seen a recent trend in the last few years where things are kind of going back a little bit to the practical effects. A lot of directors are kind of going back into that classic way of making horror films. And I look at it as a real beautiful thing of like, or a real beautiful occurrence that's happening to, return to form of how these things started. So, and the other thing about the practical effects, especially around The Thing with Rob Bottin being in charge, is that it gives you this like essence of like everything feels real, and it's tactile and it's something tangible, something you can like taste or feel, and it's all like real material, so it gives it that real organic kind of flavor. The other aspect of this film too, and that's really due to the cinematography and the direction of John Carpenter, is the atmosphere of this film. I feel like this movie completely encapsulates the idea of extreme paranoia, set in this real Arctic environment that's really cold and harsh and desolate. And the sense of isolation and paranoia is through the roof. This movie has so much suspense to it. It and it's got, just an amazing cast. Kurt Russell, one of the greatest actors, especially during that time. The level of suspense and paranoia for this film is still unprecedented, and I think that this movie still holds up. I look at it as like fine wine. It just ages better and better with each year. And the level of suspense for this movie is like unlike anything else. It really reminds me of like the classic kind of Hitchcock, aesthetic, where it's so character driven at the same time, but there's just this level of tension that just keeps building and building throughout the entire film. And originally, this story, well, there is the original, The Thing, which was directed by Howard Hawks, starring the original film that came out, The Thing, which came out in the 50s, was directed by Howard Hawks, and James Arness played the monster, which is another amazing film. And before that, the story itself, or the movie itself, was based on a book called Who Goes There, and it was a book that came out in 1938, and was written by John W. Campbell, and it's a short story, and that's basically what the two movies were based on. Were based off of that short story. The original movie, like I said, that was directed by Howard Hawks and stars James Arness as the monster, came out in 1951. I I really love that film. I think it's so, again, it's one of those films that's got incredible atmosphere. Howard Hawks was a legendary director in Hollywood at the time. And I feel like that movie, considering it came out in 1951, still holds up. It's got an incredible amount of atmosphere and suspense. The monster, played by James Arness, is amazing. It's great, and I think, and the remake, if you want to call it's pretty much a remake, but it's totally its own thing, which was directed by John Carpenter in 1982, is just a masterpiece. He definitely played. I've seen lots of interviews with John Carpenter, and he definitely pays tribute to the original short story Who Goes There, and also tips his hat to the version of the thing that came out in 1951 by Howard Hawks. But he really expanded on it and really dove into the sci-fi nature of the story, and really focused on the aspects of paranoia and that Arctic environment where the story takes place. It's incredible. Again, I want to do a show on the original one. I own that also. I have that on DVD, and that's one of my all-time favorites. It's also one of my dad's favorite movies, so we've watched that movie, growing up. My folks are also very big fans of John Carpenter's version. And this movie has had a real interesting path too. This film commercially was not very successful when it came out. It was kind of a commercial failure, which is, when you look back in hindsight, it's mind-boggling that this movie wasn't more successful. The subsequent years after this movie came out, though, it became a huge kind of phenomenon. Now it's regarded by many people, well, fans and critics all alike, as probably the best thing that John Carpenter's ever done in his entire career. It found this like cult base, fan base over a period of a few years after the movie came out, and it's become this sensation. Now it's been, I don't know how many times it's been re-released on DVD and Blu-ray and 4K. I mean, you name it. I mean, it's I've seen it across the boards like a lot in a lot of critics lists where the thing will be, when these critics or various people on YouTube will have a little show or some kind of article where they'll talk about their top 20 or top 10 horror movies of all time. A lot of the times the thing is easily on or is easily included in that list, but a lot of the times it's number one. And to think that when this film, the thing first came out, it was commercially, uh, you know, not really regarded as a force to be reckoned with. It didn't make very much money upon its release, and the trajectory that it's followed, that the path that it went on, and the trajectory around it is pretty amazing. And now it's regarded as one of the greatest sci-fi horror movies ever. Um, and and for me, the two movies I've seen the most out of all of John Carpenter's movies, or I should say the three, is Halloween, the original. Seen that film. I watch that every year around Halloween. Pretty big fan of the franchise, but particularly around that one. Halloween 3 is just amazing. He did not direct that one, but he was very much heavily involved with it. Uh, I've seen that movie so many times. And then also The Fog, which was another movie of his that I just adore. An amazing masterpiece. That's a movie I'll eventually do on this channel. And then The Thing, like those three movies are the movies I've probably seen the most out of his whole catalog. Another one too would be Escape from New York. Like those basic group of movies, those four would be the ones I've always gone back to. But The Thing is the one that's very special for me, and that's the one I always go back to, and I have probably seen overall the most. And again, like I started off this show, I have no idea why I don't own this classic on Blu-ray. I just need to get it. I'm pretty happy actually with this edition. The transfer is really great. It's pretty old. I think I got this used like many, many years ago. I've had this edition for years and years, probably 20 years. And the cool thing about the awesome aspect of this particular collection, this DVD, is the special features. There's like hours of documentaries. There's like two or three really full length documentaries that are just incredible. They go into so much detail about the making of this classic. So it's great, and it's a I think watching the special features on the thing is really it's like kind of like going to film school. It's like I've learned a lot about how these beloved films are made, and what, like, all the passion and all the work, the blood, sweat, and tears that is poured into crafting these like masterpieces. Just amazing. Um, just amazing. And recently, the last few years, John Carpenter pretty much has retired from making films. I mean, there are talks of him returning to the director's chair at some point, where I've read some things online of where he's talking, he's been in negotiations, and the idea of doing a new Escape from New York, basically a futuristic one where Kurt Russell will play Snake Plissken again, but as an older man, like playing him at his age, and it could be set like in space. That could be pretty wild, because I mean, Escape from New York and then Escape from LA came out after many years later, which I haven't seen in many, many years, but it would be cool to see that again. And Escape from New York is just an amazing thing. But that's what I've heard as far as possibility of him getting into filmmaking. But lately, the last 5 to 10 years, John Carpenter has been basically just scoring films. That's the other thing is he's scored all kinds of you know he's basically scored all of his own films. He was also one of the first independent directors to have such control over his films, not only producing them and directing them, but then involved with the writing. But then he also scored a lot of his own films. So just amazing. But the soundtrack and the score, he was not involved with the scoring or the writing of that music. And the film score was written and scored by Ennio Morricone, who is he recently died a few years back, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And Ennio Morricone is a legendary filmmaker. He's probably he's from Italy. He's probably most well known for working with Sergio Leone, the great Italian director. Ennio Morricone scored all of the classic Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns that came out in the 60s and 70s. Just amazing. Just an amazing track record. He also, like, right up until the end of his career in his life, he also scored the music for The Hateful Eight, which I think is one of my favorite Quentin Tarantino movies. It might almost be my favorite Quentin Tarantino movies, which was a western, just an amazing movie. But Ennio Morricone did the score for that, and he won an Academy Award for that. And it's just an amazing score, for an amazing film. But he scored the music for The Thing, and it is easily one of the greatest horror soundtracks ever. I mean, it might be the best, but Ennio Morricone, master filmmaker, master composer, just incredible. One of my all-time favorites. It's somebody I've always looked up to, and I always like listened to his music. I remember a few years ago I had this freak car accident, or it wasn't really a car accident, but my car had basically set itself on fire. And about a month before that crazy incident happened, I had bought a the complete box set of Ennio Morricone's music. I bought it at Bull Moose in Brunswick, and it was an amazing package. It had all of the music from all of his films, mostly concentrated on his work with Sergio Leone in the 70s and 60s with all the spaghetti westerns. But he did lots of other genres. I mean, just his catalog was just incredible. And I had bought this box set where it had all of his music in it. And when I had that fire, my car decided to catch itself on fire. That was in the car, and it went up in flames, and it was gone. So I have to eventually get it again. And I got obsessed with that box set, and I listened to it all the time, literally all the time. Just an incredible collection of music. I mean, just unprecedented. So, for me, The Thing, not only on so many levels, not only is it such a masterpiece, but the level of suspense, the camera work by Dean Cundey, the masterful direction by John Carpenter, the and the just literally out of this world score by Ennio Morricone, and the incredible effects work by Rob Bottin. The kind of the king, I think, in a lot of ways, alongside Tom Savini, the king of practical effects. I mean, unprecedented. And there's not, you can never say too many good things about this film. And again, it's like, I love all, movies from different decades, but I always go back to, especially lately, I've always gone back to a lot of these low budget, kind of grindhouse exploitation movies. And particularly, they're always in the 2 decades of the 70s and 80s. There's something about those 2 decades, particularly in the mid 70s to the mid to late 80s. That's my jam. And this movie came out in 1982, and it totally is exemplifies what an amazing period for films and for in particularly around low budget horror films, and just where all of these directors were just so creative and doing so much amazing work for while not having very big budgets, where their imagination was really their saving grace, or their imagination was what, at the end of the day, the only thing, to a degree, that they had to rely on, that they could rely on. And it really shows on the screen. And I think The Thing is like the epitome of like just classic 80s low budget horror that went on to, change the world. Like, I feel John Carpenter's work as a whole not only is some of the most influential, films that were ever made, but I think in The Thing, for instance, that movie is stuff of it's the thing that makes up legends, and one of the most influential movies of all time. I think it changed horror and science fiction forever when that movie came out. That movie's been countless, there's been countless movies that have tried to capture the magic of The Thing, and some have been good, some have failed miserably, but it just went on to influence so many movies. I mean, it's unbelievable. And John Carpenter himself, as a director, Halloween, to a degree, gave birth to like the American slasher film. So one of the greatest directors ever, the greatest film of his entire career, The Thing, 1982, just amazing. A movie I never get sick of. I can watch. It's one of those movies too, even though it's a genre specific kind of film, meaning that it's a classic sci-fi horror film. It's a movie I can watch like anytime. It's just that damn good. So thanks again. I really appreciate the support for this channel, and keep the likes coming. And if you like these crazy videos I do, and I love people commenting on the videos. I love interacting with other film fanatics. So thanks again for all the love and support, and we will see you next time. Peace.